delighted to introduce Simon Young to talk about the life and work of the writer Ellen Sloggett, who wrote under the pen names Nellie Cornwall and Enys Tregarthen, and best known for her amazing folk tales. So Simon Young studied at Clare College, Cambridge, and left with a starred first in Anglo-Saxon Norse Celtic in 1995. He trained as a medievalist, and after living in Spain for several years, completed his doctorate at the University of Florence in 2006. He currently teaches contemporary Italian religious and food history based in Italy. So he's published several books over his career, more recently on supernatural beliefs, including the Boggart Folklore History, Place Names and Dialect with Exeter University Press in 2022, which was runner-up for the Catherine Briggs Prize and was given honourable mention for the Wayland Hand Prize. And so most recently, Simon has just published the book Enys Tregarthen of Padstow, a neglected Cornish folklorist and fairyist, which I think the talk will really focus on today. So now I will hand over to Simon Young. We are very much looking forward to hearing this talk. So Ellen Sloggett is part of our current exhibition, Women of Cornwall, and we really look forward to hearing more about her.
Okay.
So Simon, over to you.
Thanks so much for the introduction. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I've just been looking at the chat and I've been seeing some familiar names. So it's great to be with you all. I'm at the moment just in my house in the hills outside of Italy. And I'm doing a number of talks, folklore talks, this spring and this summer on folklore. But this has been the one that perhaps I've most been looking forward to because Nellie Sloggett has a very special place in my heart. I say Nellie Sloggett, the talk advertised Enys Tregarthen, but as Alice explained, really Enys Tregarthen was a pen name of a Padstow writer, Nellie Sloggett. And Nellie had two pen names. Nellie Cornwall, which she used writing teenager children's fiction with a very strong Christian accent. And then Enys Tregarthen, which she used with Cornish folklore. But really, because it's a baptismal name and just out of habit, I'm going to refer to Enys as Nellie throughout. I hope that's okay. I also just want to mention a couple of things about sources before I plunge in. It has been very difficult to put together even a skeleton outline of the life of Nellie Cornwall. She wrote almost 20 books, but these books for the most part do not have autobiographical material, at least not direct autobiographical material. We have a couple of reminiscences of people who met Nellie or of people who knew Nellie. And we also have a couple of newspaper articles. We only have one letter written by Nellie, unfortunately, and we don't have a diary. And tragically, we don't have a photograph or picture, so we don't even know what she looked like. We then have the various legal and ecclesiastical documents, governmental documents, census returns, for example. But we have to use these to try and reconstruct a life. And if I use the word perhaps and maybe sometimes, I hope you'll be patient with me. As far as myself is concerned, I became interested in Nellie's writing because of her work on Cornish folklore. So I was very enthusiastic to learn more about whether the stories that she wrote as Enys Tregarthen could be exploited in my own studies as a folklore writer, a folklore historian. But I confess that Nellie herself bewitched me. And I think that in essence, this is because she had such a fascinating trajectory in her life. This was someone who was born in a very, very poor Padstow family in 1850, but who 70 years afterwards, at her death, was an established writer and one of the best read people in Northern Cornwall. It's a remarkable evolution. And what's more, Nellie overcame two appalling tragedies in her youth, tragedies that I think would have laid many people low. And I'll talk about those in a moment. But as is so often the case with biographies of writers, people who achieve things in life, in the end, these tragedies seem to have become a because of her success rather than the despite of her success. In other words, through a number of quirks of fate that span off these tragedies, she found herself in a position and with the material to write on. Okay, with that, let me start with Nellie's life. And again, remember that some of the details are rather vague. We know that Nellie was born at the very end of 1850, not 1851, as every single reference guide states. And this is just a reminder that almost everything written about Nellie Sloggett in the reference works is wrong or unsubstantiated. And she was born, as I said, in a very poor Padstow family. And what's interesting, I said Padstow family, even that's not strictly speaking accurate. Her family were based in Padstow, but her father came from across the Camel Estuary, from a poor mining family there. And her mother, Sarah Carter, who married Moses Sloggett, came from a family from further to the south, from Newquay. And they married in 1848. Moses was illiterate, as was most of his family. Sarah's family was literate. And in 1850, 2 years after the marriage, Sarah gave birth to what would be their only child. And this child was Nellie. I mentioned before the tragedies of Nellie's life, and I think I have to begin with these because they define everything that happened afterwards. When she was 6 years old, Nellie lost her father. Now, Moses was a seaman. He didn't die, though, at sea, as I originally thought when I was doing my research. The death certificate states very clearly that he died in Padstow and that he died of a fit in his mid-40s. Quite what a fit means, we're not sure. Maybe it was a stroke, maybe it was an epileptic fit, but we know he had had a series when he died. The result of this was Nellie found herself not only in a working class Padstow family, a Padstow family, though, that came from outside, so that didn't really have long established roots in the community. She was now in a single parent family in that community. Now, of course, in Victorian Britain, many people growing up lost parents. This was the nature of mortality in the 19th century. This was, unfortunately, a much more common experience than it is today. However, the next tragedy in Nellie's life is far more unusual and really quite mysterious. When Nellie was 15 or 16, the dates are not clear about this, or sources from half a century later disagree. Nellie had some kind of medical event, let's leave it like this, and became paralyzed. She lost the use of her legs. From what we know, until that point, she'd been a perfectly normal, healthy young girl. And when I did my research on Nellie 5 or 6 years ago now, I spoke to 2 different doctors, one of whom was a neurologist, about the possibilities of explaining this really sudden change. Both doctors were emphatic that the best explanation was that Nellie had had some kind of traumatic event, a physical trauma, where perhaps she'd fallen from a wall or been thrown from a horse, and that she'd simply broken her spine. However, this doesn't square with our 2 sources that talk about this, both of which mention an illness. However, it's very difficult to find an illness that fits the bill, particularly as because there was no progression during Nellie's life. There was this terrible event in her mid-teens, and after that, things didn't get worse. They didn't get better, but they didn't get worse. And Nellie found herself confined to her bed. Now, I imagine that Nellie and her mother, Sarah, in the years after this, had some very dark and sleepless nights, worrying about the future. Sarah will have expected her daughter to have joined the workforce and help provide for this small family. And of course, that simply ended as a possibility. Sarah found herself with a lifelong dependent, and Sarah must have been horrified looking towards the future. These are the nightmare scenarios where in the 19th century, if you were in a poor family, the workhouse gates start to rattle in your dreams. This is where surely it looked as if Nellie would likely end up. And yet that didn't happen. And it didn't happen because of Sarah's wider family. Sarah had a sister, Lavinia, who had married about the same time as Sarah, and had also married a seaman, a man named Charles Roll. But Sarah was far more lucky in love than Nellie. Lavinia was far more lucky in love than Sarah. Charles Roll came from a very poor agricultural family up in rural Cornwall, around about Tintagel to the north. And he'd run away to sea in his teenage years. There are some hints that he'd come from a rather difficult family. And when he was at sea, he rose very quickly through the ranks. He was clearly an extremely capable man. He became a master mariner. And then at some point, apparently in his late 30s, he became a captain on the great voyages from the west coast of Britain across to Canada. He operated out of Liverpool for several years. Now, many captains kept their position really up until a pensionable age, but Charles opted out of this in his 40s, retired and returned to Padstow and opened a shipyard in Padstow. At its height, this shipyard was supporting about 40 to 50 men and boys. So this was actually a big industrial operation in the town. And Charles Roll, who, as I said, came from this very low social background, quickly insinuated himself into Padstow's middle classes. He, for example, became a mason. He joined the local conservative society, though unusually for a conservative in this period. He was very pro-free trade and was also a member of the Free Trade Society. And he also eventually found himself on Padstow Town Council. He became, in the end, the head of Padstow Town Council. His name is commemorated in the town hall until this day. And he also became a magistrate, which is an extraordinary trajectory, really, from a poor boy from the Badlands of northern Cornwall. I mean, just in a couple of decades, he turned really his social life around completely. And Charles's history is relevant because Nellie and Sarah were now sucked into his orbit. In Nellie's mid-20s, Charles had started the shipyard, and he also bought a beautiful villa by the side of the harbour. And this is Marine Villa. And there he moved his entire family. And his entire family at this date consisted of his wife, Lavinia, 5 children, all daughters, Maria Carter, this was his mother-in-law, Sarah Carter, his sister-in-law, and his niece, Nellie. And so there were 9 women living in a house with 1 man. And I speak as a man who lives in a house with 4 women. And I'm sure that the Charles Roll's house had an unusual social dynamic. This would be my guess anyway. Nellie found herself as one of the older members of this household because her cousins were rather younger. And all the hints we have are that Nellie became effectively another sister. She was treated as a member of the family. She dedicates some of her later works to her cousins, and eventually she would go and live with her cousins when Charles Roll passed on. So this seems to have been a quite successful family unit. It was certainly a wealthy family unit, and Nellie seems to have lived in one of the rooms on the upper floor, and she had a marvellous view over Padstow Harbour. And of course, this mattered because she spent most of her time in bed. Now, in bed, what did she do? Well, for a young woman in this period who was paralysed, she could have done needlework. We have no hint that this was the case, but she could also read, and we know that Nellie did an awful lot of this. When I did my research into Nellie, I went through tirelessly all the books, not just the Enys Tregarthen books, but the Nellie Cornwall books, trying to write down all the books that I could demonstrate that she was familiar with. And she had clearly eaten her way through a very large library. by the time she was already in her early 30s. We have a fascinating glimpse of Nellie's life in this period from her one letter that survives. This is a letter to the family of a Methodist preacher, Benjamin Gregory, who worked for a time in Padstow and who died, and Nellie wrote a letter commiserating with Benjamin Gregory's parents. And she gives a beautiful, I suppose, vignette of their first meeting. Benjamin Gregory would become a mentor for Nellie. And she describes how he walked into her room, and she remembered vividly this first encounter between them. And as soon as he walked into the room, he strolled over to her bookshelf, and you immediately have this sense of two people who live in a world of learning. Both were very learned people. And he took down a Hebrew grammar, because we learned that Nellie had been teaching herself Hebrew. This was one of her 3 or 4 languages. And he also commented on some of the Christian poetry that she had, and they sat and talked, and he began to teach her in subsequent months and years New Testament Greek. The thing that I take away from this letter, though, is that Nellie was already clearly embarked on this path of learning on her own. She had bought the Hebrew grammar. This was already on her shelves. She had all these books of poetry and literature. And when I think of Nellie, I think that we need to imagine an autodidact, someone who had done this stuff on her own. She came from literate families, at least in the case of her mother's family and Charles Roll, but there's no hint really of any great education. This was something that she was creating from the bottom floor upwards. Now, in her 20s, we know that she began to contribute to religious periodicals, particularly perhaps for religious periodicals for young people. Unfortunately, none of this writing has survived. Or maybe we've just not been able to find it yet. Maybe she wrote under another name. Maybe she wrote under no name. 19th century religious literature is very ephemeral and often disappears. The other possibility is, well, hopefully sooner or later, some of this literature will come to light, but we've not found it yet. She really crosses our radar, though, as a writer in the mid-1880s, when in her 30s, she starts to publish books. And really, for the first 20 or so years of her writing career as an author with books, she publishes under the name of Nellie Cornwall. Now, my memory is that Nellie wrote about 14 Nellie Cornwall books. And these are remarkable productions in some ways. They're all books for children, but then by no means uniform. Some are for really quite young children, 5, 6 years old, and some are for quite sophisticated adolescents, I would say. They make for difficult and sophisticated reading. They have all in common, though, that they were published by religious publication houses. And like a lot of Victorian Christian literature, they were broadly ecumenical. In other words, they appealed to many parts of the Christian spectrum, or at least the Christian Protestant spectrum. And Nellie herself came from a background in nonconformism. She'd been baptized by a rather radical Methodist sect, the Bible Christians, baptized into that as a baby. And her life also brought her into a great deal of contact with Anglicans. Charles Roll particularly seems to have been a Tory high Anglican. So she had both sides of this. And I think for modern readers, this is part of Christian or Victorian culture, which is very difficult for us to relate to. It's rather difficult to read these books just because they have such a strong Christian charge. And I think that even a Christian today would have difficulty reading them, just because there is an element of sermonizing in these books, which can sometimes be a little hard to take. Having said that, I read all of these books when I was going through Nellie's work. I'd read all but one, actually. One is very rare, and I had a friend send me a summary. And I think they're very capable productions. And I was pleasantly surprised going through my notes for this talk that I really remembered lots of the plots very well. and many of them create very vivid characters and very vivid scenes. And if anyone here today is interested in experimenting with one of these books, I would advise a book that I think was the last Nellie Cornwall book that was written, though it was the last but one to be published. And this is The Little Don. This was written in the first person as a series of diary entries of a Cornish man who finds in middle age that he has to take on the guardianship of a young child, a child of a friend who has died, and he also simultaneously falls in love. I mean, Nellie Sloggett was not in any sense a poor writer. She was, I think, a very gifted English stylist. One reviewer at the time, in the 1890s, early 1890s, wrote what I would consider a rather bitchy review, but I think that gets at the truth of her writing and the way that this writing perhaps didn't always work even with contemporary audiences. The quotation, and I'm doing this from memory, so forgive me if I get a couple of words wrong, but the quotation is something like, Miss Cornwall, in her writing, talks about Christianity rather more than is the case in everyday life, and indeed rather more than is desirable. And I think that this gets a little bit at the essence of Nellie, and I hope you have a sense. She was an extremely earnest, very sincere Christian, and she wanted to spread this message, but sometimes there was this slightly preachy element in her writing. Having said that, her religious character seems to change, and I'm going to go into this because it becomes relevant, I think, for her folklore writing. In her last book, The Little Don, what I think anyway was the last book she wrote, she has a fascinating Quaker character who is very, very attractive as an individual, as a personality on the page. And this Quaker character describes her own pilgrimage, really, from a nonconformist background into the arms of the church. And she gives several speeches on how, in the end, for her, the sacraments are necessary, a necessary part of Christian life. And I think here we probably see Nellie's own journey towards a more high church version of Christianity. Now, I hope the relevance for this may or may not, we'll see, become relevant become clearer rather in a couple of minutes. Anyway, all of this changes, and here I'm going to struggle to find my slideshow, so please just bear with me for a second. All of this changes in 1905. By now, you should be able to see an image on the screen. I have 3 or 4 images to share with you. When Nellie Sloggett introduces a new pen name. This is Enys Tregarthen. Nellie Sloggett, I think, is about as Anglo-Saxon a name as you could find. Nellie Cornwall is a rather nice compromise. Enys Tregarthen is unashamedly Cornish and let's say Celtic in the 19th century sense. And in this book, Pisky Purse, Nellie Sloggett begins to write children's stories based on Cornish folklore. Before she died, she wrote at least 42 of these stories, and these are published in 3 volumes that Nellie brought out in her lifetime, 1905, I think 1907 and 1911, publication of her last book, in fact. And then 3 books that were published after her death, and I hope to speak a little bit more about this later. Now, for me as a reader, the great mystery, particularly after slogging my way through Nellie Cornwall, was how on earth someone who was so part of the Christian life, clearly burning with this very sincere message, had turned to Cornish folklore, and not just Cornish folklore, but supernatural folklore, something that many people from a nonconformist background in this period would have seen as being blasphemous, or at least perhaps not quite the right word, sorry, but unholy. And I think a clue to this might come in a book that was only published in 2014. Between the 1930s and the 1990s, over 60 years, a Nottingham legal secretary by the name of Marjorie Johnson collected tirelessly. Marjorie lived till she was 101. She collected tirelessly fairy accounts from Britain of people who had had meetings with fairies in one respect or another. And I was very lucky to find the manuscript and help with the publication of this book. And I almost dropped the manuscript, I remember, when reading it, I found a reference to Nellie Sloggett. Now, again, I'm going to quote from memory, but a woman who was resident in Padstow, whose name, unfortunately, I cannot recall, I think it's Agnes something, wrote that when I wish, she was writing to Marjorie, I wish you'd met my friend Nellie Sloggett, because when I used to visit Nellie Sloggett, Nellie would sometimes see fairies playing around my shoulders. Now, this is not something we would have expected of the author of many of the Nellie Cornwall books. I personally think that Nellie's worldview was a little bit shaken up in the 1890s. Maybe part of a change moving towards a broader high Anglicanism, which perhaps is a little bit, allows a bit more space. Let's say is a little bit less doctrinaire in some respects, at least in terms of thinking outside the church. And I think that this gave her the chance to start exploring, I don't want to say alternative forms of spirituality, but perhaps other interests. If she really did see fairies, this is incredible. But certainly in the 6 books we have, she's very interested in people who do have these experiences. And she writes about them as if they're simple facts. I've given you here an image from one of her first 2 books. And this is an image of perhaps the most common Southwestern fairy experience. This is being pisky-led or being pixie-led. In other words, you go out for a walk and the pixies cast their glamour on you and you become disoriented. This particularly happens at night and you become lost. And here you can see the pixies dancing around. I think it's Jan Pendergast is the hero of the story. And there's a lovely little side reference here that the illustrator has Jan reaching his left hand down towards the pocket, because I'm sure, as you all know, if you ever find yourself pixie-led at night, what you have to do is put your hand into your pocket, pull your pocket out, and by turning the pocket inside out, you therefore banish, you break the spell, and you come back to your proper senses. And so Nellie wrote actually 4 stories, 4 from her 42 stories are on this subject. And so she created this wonderful series of tales. I'm going to show you a couple of these illustrations. Again, just to give you a flavour, this is a Padstow story. 11 of the 42 stories are set in the town of Padstow, or in the parish anyway of Padstow, let's say. And this is a story that seems to have been children's folklore in the mid-19th century and perhaps beyond. On Padstow Church, on the facade, there is a stone unicorn, a stone knight, and a stone lion. And apparently the children had a rhyme that they used to taunt these 3 figures with, and sometimes the figures were so provoked that they would come down and chase the children, which is what you are seeing here. Okay, so with this, I think I need to justify a little bit about why we should care about Nellie Cornwall, particularly from my point of view as someone writing on folklore. As I said before, I came very much for the fairies. I wanted to see whether Nellie Sloggett was able to tell us more about beliefs in her part of Cornwall in the 19th and early 20th century. And here I'm just going to speak for a couple of minutes about Cornish folklore, and particularly Cornish folklore collection in the 19th century. In England, in the 19th century, there were 4 major poles of folklore collection. This is something I've worked on a lot in the past few years. There were some counties where really just no one bothered. I've been trying to write a folklore history of Bedfordshire. It's very, very difficult because just no one wrote anything down. But there were 4 places where there was extensive collection. These 4 places in reverse order were the very large south of London county of Sussex, and then probably in 3rd place, Norfolk and Suffolk, so East Anglia. And then in 2nd place, Yorkshire and Lancashire, and particularly the South Pennines, so southeastern Lancashire and the West Pennines, the let's say the West Riding as then was. But in first place, without any question, there is Devon and Cornwall. And Cornwall particularly was very lucky because in the second half of the 19th century, three writers of outstanding ability set their talents to writing about Cornish folklore. In order of publication, these were Robert Hunt, William Bottrell, and the remarkable and very talented Margaret Courtney. And what this means is that by the time we got to 1900, Cornish readers had 5 very, very good volumes on Cornish folklore, far above the league. I mean, in another league compared with all other counties, well, all English counties. However, and I think this is something that folklore historians often miss, it's true that Cornwall was very well covered, but the vast majority of this writing was about the western third of the county. Okay. And in fact, I would go further. I would say that a good majority was about the western fifth of the county. It was very much focused on Western Cornwall. And I don't think we need blame the authors for this. This was just a question of the sources they had. It may also be to an extent where folklore had survived better. But to have someone who is capable and who can write well on the northern coast of Cornwall in this period is a question. I mean, it's a matter of opening champagne. It would have been a wonderful, wonderful thing because that writer could effectively plug a gap in our knowledge. And I just want to give you a sense of how poor our knowledge of northern folklore, northern Cornish folklore was before Nellie. The picture you see here is of one of the great British hill forts and certainly one of the great Cornish sites. This is Castle Enys, not that far to the south from Padstow, a truly dramatic, charismatic location. I think just by looking at this, anyone who knows anything about folklore would tell you that local communities would have a good deal of folklore about this site. The problem is that we had no one there to collect this folklore. And so the result is when we try and gather together the folklore for this incredible place, that really is in British terms on a level with, say, South Cadbury or Glastonbury in terms of the charisma of the site. We have one very late 15th century reference, a sentence which connects Castle Enys to Arthurian legend. We're lucky to have a sentence from the 18th century that does, from a slightly different perspective, the same thing. In the mid-19th century, we learned that locals had seen miniature armies fighting at Castle Enys. It's not clear if they saw them in the castle or in the sky, in the fort or in the sky. And then let's see, in 1906, Jenner, one of the Cornish revivalists who'd grown up very, very close to Castle Enys, describes talking to an old man who had seen Arthur's phantom army there. And when asked how he could see them in the dark, he gave the memorable answer that he'd seen the moonlight glinting on their flintlocks. And then the last source I know comes from the 1930s from a Cornish newspaper and describes, of all things, a Viking phantom that was believed to walk around the fort. It would be easy to put all of these 5 sources on a single page in a modern published book. They're very, very few. But Nellie also wrote about Castle Enys. Her maternal grandmother, Maria, had come from this parish. And she writes a 12-page story that, though she didn't know the other sources, fits very well with these tiny hints we find elsewhere. It's called The Pixie Battle, and it describes a woman who gets lost in the mist, ends up on Castle Enys, and discovers, first through hearing and then through her sight, a battle that's being held between 2 pixie armies. There's this memory of some kind of martial engagement connected with Castle Enys. And of course, one of the consequences of this then is that Nellie had these local sources, and these local sources are very valuable in this respect. Now, here I've put on a map of Cornwall, this is a parish by parish map, or the old parish boundaries, numbers relating to how many of the 42 of Nellie's stories as Enys Tregarthen come from these different Cornish parishes. You will see, of course, a massive concentration around Padstow. 11 of the stories were set in Padstow, but you can also see numbers from thereabouts. If you look at the parish that has the 3 in it, this is the parish with Gosmore and Castle Andinas, where Nellie had these links through her grandma across the Camel Estuary. There were 2 stories. This was where her father came from. Nellie probably had connections with the Sloggett family there. And then up further the coast towards Tintagel, it's very possible that the stories she heard came from Charles Roll. And so Nellie is a dream for Cornish folklore. And yet Cornish folklorists just haven't, for the most part, taken Nellie seriously. And this has only, I think, started to change in the last few years. I brought with me today the most important Cornish book of Cornish folklore, and this is the one I'm holding up now. This is on the folklore of Cornwall, and it's by Dean and Shaw, and it was published in the 70s. I say the most important. This is the most important book of Cornish folklore between, I would say, really the 1890s and Ron James's fantastic book on Cornish folklore that just came out a couple of years ago in 2018. There is not a single mention of Enys Tregarthen in this book, because Enys Tregarthen was, as far as the authors here was concerned, a children's writer, and she wasn't writing proper folklore anyway. Now, here I think we need to make a distinction between what they would have called proper folklore and perhaps another style of folklore writing. There are basically 2 ways I think you can use folklore in children's fiction. The first is the method that's used by writers like C.S. Lewis, J.K. Rowling, Susan Cooper, for any of you who grew up with these authors. And this is, you take characters and ideas and even motifs out of folklore and you incorporate them into your own stories. The second thing you can do is you can take traditional stories and you might dress them up a little bit, but basically you give the traditional story as it was told. The second of these is folklore, and if you publish those, it is a form of folklore collection. The first is not folklore. It's interesting and it uses folklore themes, but it's another subject. And the million-dollar question is, which of these Enys Tregarthen was writing? When we think of these 42 stories, which category do they fall into? And the messy answer is, well, there are 2 parts to the messy answer. First of all, both. She wrote stories that she clearly confected herself, but there are other stories where we know her source, we know the place she got them from, and we can be absolutely certain that these are traditional tales, and the tales correspond to stories from elsewhere in Cornwall. And then, yes, so she's using both. The great problem, and this is the second part of the messiness, is that she never tells us in the individual stories whether a story is one that she's created herself or one that she's taken from a neighbour, a friend, or a relative. Now, I'm going to give you this as a last slide. This is the book that Alice alluded to at the beginning. And this is a book, it's really a book of folklore sources. And I brought it out in this small publishing house I run with folklore sources, British, Irish folklore sources. And it essentially reproduces the essay that I published in 2017. It's been lightly revised in the meantime. And I also put into this volume 14 stories, the 14 stories that I think we can be relatively sure are traditional Cornish tales that Nellie Sloggett actually collected in 8 cases. I think there is absolutely no doubt. She gives us names and places. In the case of the other 6, we can argue about it, but my personal feeling is that these stories are close enough to traditional Cornish narratives that we're probably dealing with genuine folklore, though of what kind, I'm not sure. This book, by the way, is available on Amazon, and it retails for £20, but it's a hardback volume with about 300 pages. Now, if you're interested in this, but you prefer not to shed out the money, when I finish speaking, I will put the web address of my academia address. And there in the section on Enys Tregarthen, there is the 2017 essay that's very similar to the biography that I give here. And there is also these 14 stories in PDF, so you can get these very easily. Okay, well, with this, I'm going to quickly start winding down now. We come really to the end of Nellie's story and Nellie's life. We have a last and very precious reference from 1923, when two American fans of Enys Tregarthen found their way to Cornwall and toured around the county looking at the sites they'd read about as children. And when they got to Padstow, they asked people where Enys Tregarthen was. And of course, I'm sure many of you will be able to guess the answer. No one in Padstow had heard of Enys Tregarthen. And it was only finally when they got to the post office that someone said, "I think you may be talking about our Miss Sloggett." And they were sent up to Nellie's new house. Her uncle had died and she was now living with one of her cousins. She had a wonderful view across the moors and across the bay. And we have this description of these two women sitting down and essentially having tea with Nellie. And Nellie explains to them, she says, there's publishers only have time for so much fairy writing. And this, I think, is a very important clue that Nellie had continued writing in the meantime. And this is borne out by some proofs I'll give you in a minute. She also says that she was writing poetry. And she was planning to publish a volume of her poetry. We've no idea what happened to this. And 4 months later, unfortunately, Nellie was dead. We're very, very lucky, really, to have this account. The last part of Nellie's story takes place after her death. A young American want-to-be writer, Elizabeth Yates, in the late 1930s, traveled to Britain with her husband, and she got to Britain really just on the cusp of the Second World War. And Elizabeth Yates would go on to be one of America's great young adult authors in the post-war period. She travelled through parts of southern Britain, but she was particularly interested in Cornwall because her hero, Enys Tregarthen, had lived there. One of the very satisfying things about Nellie's writing as Enys Tregarthen is she got a lot more satisfaction and fame from this writing than she had for her works with Nellie Cornwall. And of course, Nellie at this point was in Padstow graveyard, but Elizabeth Yates was able to meet up with Alice, and this is Nellie's cousin. And Alice, I think, showing a certain wisdom, saw something in Elizabeth's eyes, I'm guessing, and produced a huge hamper that was full of Enys Tregarthen's unpublished writings. Elizabeth left Britain some months later. She took these writings with her. Britain at this point was in a state of war, and she flew back to the United States with her husband. And at this point, she undertook to publish these last tales, and she was good to her word. She did this, and 3 more Enys Tregarthen volumes came out as a result. And with this, really, I've come to the end of the lecture. I just want to end, though, with a couple of thoughts, proactive thoughts about what remains to be done in terms of the studies of Nellie Sloggett and our knowledge about her. And I've written down here 5 points. The first of these points is, as I said at the beginning, our reference works for Nellie are a disgrace. And it would be really good if someone who was able at these things, if nothing else, set about cleaning up the Wikipedia page on Nellie Sloggett, beginning with her birth date. The second thing I've written down is, I don't think we would be here if Nellie had never published Enys Tregarthen. But having said that, her Nellie Cornwall books are interesting. They're a part of 19th century Cornish literature, and it would be really wonderful if we could set to scanning them all. I think there are 14 books, and I've scanned in a very rough fashion 2 of these. It would be wonderful if someone could set about doing that and putting them online, available for everyone. Some are very easy to find. Some are extremely expensive and rare. It would perhaps be rather difficult. A third thing would be to get the Enys Tregarthen volumes scanned online. 2 of them are easily available. The other 4, you really have to buy a physical copy of them. And of course, the dream there, and this would be a wonderful task, I think, for a young Cornish folklorist in his or her 20s, would be to bring out a 2-volume hardback edition of Old 42 Tales, properly annotated, and if it were possible to put up a free version online to share more generally, this would be even better. We then have the question, number 4, of other sources from Nellie. When I wrote my article, I was helped by a number of Padstow writers, and I was particularly helped by John Buckingham, a Padstow historian. And I don't think there's going to be much to find in Padstow, just because John did such an outstandingly good job of raking over every last bit of information. It takes my breath away to think of what John managed to do in terms of gathering sources. And so my suspicion is there's not going to be anything else from Padstow. I do, though, think that we can find other letters by Nellie. We know she wrote a lot of letters. We find this information in 2 sources, both of which said she wrote to famous people. And I'm now on the cusp of my 50th birthday. I confidently predict here today, to go on YouTube for posterity, that by the time I'm 70, we will have more than the one Nellie Sloggett letter we have today. Libraries are getting much better at putting up proper reference guides to their archives of unpublished letters, and in many cases digitizing them. By the time we get to 2044, I think we will have more Nellie Sloggett letters. Another piece of evidence that I would die happy if I could see would be a photograph of Nellie Sloggett. I used to think that this was going to be a very long shot, but maybe just growing older, I've become more optimistic about certain things. And it strikes me that Nellie had a very important physical characteristic, namely she couldn't stand. And I wonder whether getting together the many Padstow photographs of bazaars, fetes, middle-class Padstow society to which Nellie very much belonged, whether we might not start to spot a woman in the corner in a bath chair, a woman in a photograph who is seated when others are standing, and maybe we could start to not be certain, but start to ask whether this wasn't Nellie. It would be wonderful to see the face that created these marvelous works. And then the 5th thing I would say, the final thing, it's not really for Nellie's research, but more for her legacy. To the best of my knowledge, Padstow still does not have one of those marvelous blue discs commemorating Nellie. And I think that Nellie is certainly one of Padstow's most famous sons or daughters. And I think it would be wonderful if this could be put right in the future. If I'm wrong about this, and I know there are people from Padstow here today, please by all means slap my hands. But I think Padstow is still lacking that. Okay, and with this, I'll hand back to Amanda and to Alice. Thank you very much for your patience.